Our guest is Edward Lucas, British security expert. Hello, Edward. Welcome to Deutsche Welle.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Your former employer, The Economist magazine, has a picture of Donald Trump on its cover riding a polar bear, bare-chested, Vladimir Putin style. The Economist urges Europeans to get ready for a day when NATO, I quote, is no more. So is NATO already dead or just damaged after Trump's speech in Davos? What do you think?
I think NATO is dying. I think it's a bit like a marriage where you have one of the partners in the marriage using threats of violence and mocking the other partner for being trusting and idealistic. And the marriage may survive in the sense of a sort of transactional arrangement where you share bills and combine to deal with some obligations. But the emotional heart of it has gone. And I think that's what Trump's done to NATO. So we are now really in a new era where we regard the United States as sometimes a partner that we can work with, but sometimes an adversary. And we are faced in Europe with the very grave difficulty of trying to create a new security alliance at very high speed.
What could that security alliance look like?
Well, I think that the first thing is to look at the political cohesion. Europe is very rich and it's very big. We know that Russia has an economy the size of Italy. So this is not the sort of problem we would face if we were dealing with China. But there are many gaps, particularly on the military side. The United States provides the high-tech capabilities. It supplies a lot of the intelligence. It supplies the nuclear umbrella. It supplies the logistics, the so-called enablers. And it is also very important when it comes to reinforcement and to stockpiles. And so Europe will have to work extremely hard and spend a lot of money to fill the gap left by the United States. The best we can hope for, I think, is an orderly United States withdrawal from Europe over a period of a few years where the Europeans can fill the gap. The danger is that it's a disorderly withdrawal and then we're left with very severe vulnerabilities.
So you think that the United States will pull out of Europe, especially it is important for Germany, where about 50,000 US troops are stationed?
We can't rely on the United States. The United States may want to rely on Europe, and that will be a matter for bargaining. So I imagine that Ramstein, for example, will remain because it's very important for the United States. But if you ask yourself, if the Kremlin attacked a NATO member, would Donald Trump funnel American combat power into Europe in order to resist that attack? Would he be willing to risk nuclear war to defend Europe? I think most Europeans would say no. And if you cannot depend on the United States, then you have to substitute for the United States.
And what is your answer? Will he? So will Trump support Europe if Russia attacks?
I think this is going to be the big test of European diplomacy. So in the answer to your question, I think we can't be sure. And if you can't be sure, then you have to make plans accordingly. The big test of European diplomacy is whether we can manage the American withdrawal. We need to show that we're useful to the Americans on things that they care about. We need to work out what gaps need to be plugged most urgently and how to substitute for this American security blanket, which we have been keeping ourselves warm under for the last nearly 80 years.
Do you think the Russian President Vladimir Putin might be tempted now to test NATO after the Greenland crisis?
I think Putin is already testing NATO, and we see systematic sub-threshold provocations inside NATO countries, and also the war in Ukraine, which is really a big test of NATO's credibility. And we are flunking those tests. We've shown that we are scared of Putin's nuclear blackmail, so we didn't really put pressure on Russia, and we didn't really give Ukraine the weapons it needed to win when it had a chance of winning at the start of the war. We don't have the defense to deal with these attacks on the seabed and in our airspace and elsewhere. And we also don't have deterrence. We don't have something that we can do that makes the Russians really scared. We do have these things, but Russians know we won't use them. So we are failing this test, and the result is the provocations from Russia are increasing in scope and in intensity and in frequency.
But do you think that the probability of a Russian test on the eastern flank of NATO has grown and something could happen this year, 2026?
I would question your use of the word eastern flank. That would imply that we are being attacked from the north. I mean, I would say that the countries bordering Russia are the ones that are really vigilant, have excellent readiness, strong social cohesion, and would be very hard nuts to crack. I think it's highly unlikely that Russia would try something in Finland, the Baltic states, or Poland. I'm much more worried about countries further west. I'm worried about Germany. I'm worried about Britain. I think this is where Russia is more likely to continue to escalate its provocations. But as I stress, Russia is already testing us and we are already failing.
Coming back to Davos, what do you think made Donald Trump change his mind on tariffs against 8 European countries, including the UK and Germany, who have sent soldiers to Greenland as a gesture of solidarity?
I wouldn't connect these things. I think if you read The Art of the Deal, you'll see that Trump says you always start a negotiation with a lot of threats and bombast, and you try and frame the negotiation in a way that the result you want seems like a very moderate concession from the other side compared with all the things that might have happened. And I think this is classic Art of the Deal, that he came in with threats of military action, he came with threats of tariffs. He said he wanted the whole of Greenland and it had to be basically American. And it's looked like he's settling for some sovereign bases on Greenland. And that's fine if you're on a real estate negotiation, but the result is very bruising. Your countries are left feeling that they can't trust the United States. It's, as I said at the beginning, like the threats of domestic violence in a marriage. So he's won the deal that he wants, but I would say it's at a very high cost in terms of American credibility and American likability. And in terms of America as something that we can believe in. I don't know what it means now to be pro-American. All my life, I've known that America was the sort of citadel of Western values, and they made terrible mistakes. I was a true believer in the Atlantic Alliance, and I can't be a true believer now because I don't know what it means to believe in America. Does it mean believing in Donald Trump's schemes to get rich quick? Does it mean believing in the Monroe Doctrine? But the old America, the American of the Truman Doctrine, that was the bastion of European freedom against communist tyranny, that's gone.
By threatening several but not all European countries with tariffs, President Trump seems to have tried to divide and weaken Europe. Do you think he was successful?
Trump's always playing divide and rule. I mean, it's notable that he absolutely won't talk to the European Union. Kaja Kallas, von der Leyen, the other European leaders don't get any hearing in Washington, and it actually says in the national security strategy they don't like the European Union. So the European Union is the expression of European unity. Trump's against that. But absolutely, he wants to deal with individual countries. He doesn't really understand that there's a customs union and a single market. He thinks he can do one deal with Italy and another one with Germany and so on. And there's an odd kind of symmetry that both Putin is playing divide and rule in Europe, and Xi Jinping is playing divide and rule in Europe, and Trump is playing divide and rule in Europe. And the result is that Europe is much weaker than it should be. Europe, in its broadest sense, including the Brits and the Turks and the Norwegians and so on, is a $30 trillion GDP economy with 550 million people. That's a superpower. But we, because we're divided, we don't act like a superpower. And as I've repeatedly said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I worry that Europe is on the menu right now because it doesn't act with unity and decisiveness.
We are speaking before the European Union Emergency Summit. So something could come out of it. We don't know. But what do you think of the European response so far? There was a discussion about the so-called bazooka, which is a European mechanism to counter countries that are putting economic pressure on Europe. It was designed against China. Now it was brought up in the discussion against the United States.
I think the difficulty of picking a fight with the United States is that the United States can hurt Europe more than Europe can hurt the United States. So I think there's a limit to the what we can do on that front. I think it's much better to concentrate on building our own capabilities and showing that we are united and effective. So, for example, I'm a strong supporter of the proposed European Rearmament Bank, which would be like an EBRD, but for defence, and could quite quickly raise 250 billion euros for rearmament of projects, improving Europe's defence industrial base, supporting innovation, and most of all, improving our defence and deterrence. So there's plenty we can do. We could also look at our economic dynamism, as Mr. Draghi outlined in the Draghi report. We could go ahead with many other projects that would make Europe seem like a capable partner. And that would improve our negotiating position with the United States. But I fear at the moment that if we go for a full-scale confrontation with the United States, Trump can just say, well, I'm telling the Supreme Allied Commander Europe to come home, and I'm withdrawing the American security guarantee, because in the end, it's his decision as Commander-in-Chief whether to go to war on behalf of Europe, and that would leave us in a very difficult position. So I think the Europeans are right to be a bit cautious about going for a full-scale trade war, full-scale competition or confrontation with the United States. But there are things we could do. I mean, just slightly reducing our holdings of treasury bills, for example, and our holdings of dollars, that would already put further pressure on the American financial markets, which are already signaling that they're not very happy with President Trump's approach.
What will happen to Greenland now? What do you think? Is annexation finally off the table?
Well, I think annexation was a negotiating gambit, as I said earlier. And I think what's actually going to happen is there will be some sort of preemptive American rights when it comes to mineral resources, because what they don't want is a China-friendly government coming to power in Nuuk, in the Greenlandic capital, which would then sell mineral concessions to the Chinese. And I think that that's a reasonable worry. We've seen a lot of efforts in past years by the Chinese to build up influence in Greenland. So more importantly is the question of American military bases in Greenland. Now, in fact, they have everything they want, but again, they would be vulnerable to a Greenlandic government that came in and said, Yankees go home. And so what they're going to get is sovereign bases, it seems, which are rather like the British bases in Cyprus, which are kind of, fundamentally British, although they're technically on Cypriot soil, and there's nothing the Cypriot government can do easily to get rid of them. So if the American bases in Greenland become sovereign bases, then that will also solidify the American defense posture there. Now, of course, I think the United States could probably have got that anyway. It didn't need to go through all these sort of shenanigans that President Trump has been conducting in past days. But of course, Trump likes this because he loves being the center of attention. He loves this sort of swagger, this swashbuckling approach. That's very much part of his style, and he thinks he gets political benefits from it. I think actually he put strain on Republican unity in Congress, and a lot of Americans were rather unhappy with the threats of force. And as often happens with Trump, once he sees which way the wind is blowing, politically or financially, he trims his sails accordingly.
Speaking about Germany, you know Germany very well. The German Chancellor Friedrich Merz was more moderate on Donald Trump if compared to the French President Macron or the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, whose speech many praise as historic. Do you think Friedrich Merz was too soft on Trump?
No, I think there's a balance between what you say publicly and what you say privately. There's a balance between words and deeds. There's a balance between what you do to shore up your own capabilities when you're in a transactional relationship and what you do to try and put pressure on the other side. So I think that the thing I most of all want is European unity. And neither Chancellor Merz nor President Macron are exemplary in that regard. And I would be very keen, for example, to see Donald Tusk brought front and center in the negotiations, because it's been a success of the United States to try and isolate Donald Tusk and his government in order to promote President Nawrocki of Poland, who they see as an ally. So I'd push back against that. And I would also insist that at every meeting that Ursula von der Leyen or Kaja Kallas or one of the other European union leaders is there because we shouldn't allow Trump to dictate who speaks for Europe. But I'm afraid that none of the big countries are really that enthusiastic about having the European Union centre stage. So that's not totally surprising. But there are many things we could do on the symbolic diplomatic front to show unity, as well as all the practical things that I've mentioned already.
Do you think that Donald Trump could somehow try to trade Greenland for the continuing US support of Ukraine?
Well, I'm not sure how much continuing US support there is of Ukraine, really. I mean, there's the American support is tiny now compared with the European Union's or European countries' efforts. I think if Donald Trump really wanted to pull the rug from under Ukraine, he could have done it already. So I think he's basically happy with this sort of drip feed because it gives him leverage. It's, I think, rather similar to him staying in NATO. If you pull out and say, be gone, the lot of you, then you don't have any more leverage. Well, if you're inside, people still hope you may do more, and it gives you a bit more purchasing, a bit more purchase, a bit more leverage. So I think that the real question for Ukraine is, would the Europeans do more? And there's a great deal more we could do. We could put real pressure on Russia, on the shadow fleet, on the frozen Russian assets, on the enablers who allow the Russian war machine to keep going. And there's plenty more we could do to support Ukraine, particularly giving more long-range weapons, more money, more support of all kinds. But we are, I'm afraid, watching Ukraine slowly bleed because we're a bit too scared and a bit too stingy to deliver the help we need. And it's perhaps quite convenient for European leaders to blame that on President Trump. When I can see why the Americans are annoyed about that. They would say, why is it that 320 million Americans have to help 550 million Europeans defend a country of 40 million people against 140 million Russians? Do it yourself, you're rich.
So do you think that Greenland crisis could somehow boost support for Ukraine? Or the other thing might happen, the opposite actually, that the Europeans would say, we need more weapons for ourselves to defend ourselves. Denmark is one of the strongest supporters of Ukraine. Denmark could also say we need those weapons for ourselves.
Well, for a start, I think Greenland is going to be forgotten now. I mean, we were talking about Panama a few months ago, then it was Canada, now it's Greenland. The lawyers will take over and there will be a long, boring process. And I suspect that it will fall off the agenda. Trump will feel he's got what he basically got what he wanted. So I wouldn't connect the Greenland crisis now to any future big developments in Europe. But yes, the Europeans have had a horrible shock. And I hope they learn from this shock, both to improve their own defenses and their own cohesion.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin seemed, so we haven't heard much from him since the beginning of the year, after Venezuela, after the US have seized a Russian tanker in the Atlantic. Do you think Putin is now just sitting back and relaxing, watching NATO unravel? So how would he react to the Greenland crisis, do you think?
Well, as I said, I don't think we should generally let Donald Trump and his political gambits live rent-free in our heads. And I think it's extraordinary the way that we sit here in Europe with so much on our plate that we could do right now. And we instead were thinking about what's happening between Trump and what is Trump saying and doing. I think Putin is delighted to see disunity in the Atlantic Alliance. He's delighted to see disunity in Europe and disunity within European countries. I don't think he's relaxing because things aren't going very well for him in Ukraine. The small advances he makes come at enormous costs, and we see all sorts of political, economic, social and other stresses within Russia. I wish we were doing more to make those stresses worse. But I think there's also some sign that Xi Jinping is not totally happy about the way things are going. So I don't think Putin is sitting back and relaxing, but certainly when we make mistakes, that's Russia's benefit.
Thank you very much for your opinion, Edward Lucas, British security expert. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.